Before changing a table, a procedure, or a trigger in your Oracle PL SQL code, it's crucial to know what will be affected. Visual Expert helps you anticipate the impact of any code change. To find all references to a table or column with Visual Expert, you can select that table or one of its columns and use this feature called Impact Analysis to display all the elements that contain at least one reference to this table or column. Here, for example, we have a trigger that contains 3 SQL statements referencing the ID column of the product table at lines 27, 34, and 38. Here we have another example, a small procedure that also contains a reference. And you can see that each time the referenced element, in this case a column, is highlighted in yellow, and the relevant line number is displayed in red, so you can visually find it more easily. Similarly, you can find all references to a function. Just select it and use the Impact Analysis feature to display all elements that use or reference it. Again, in the source code here on line number 5, you'll see the reference to the selected procedure. The same goes for this other function.